because now you have this moment where lots of groups that were in one part of the political spectrum, they're suddenly free agents, and they're out there and open for the taking if either side is smart enough to figure out a way to get to them.
Yeah, right now we have a lot of things moving at once. We have the parties themselves are in motion, and then the voters themselves are in motion. And so this is all happening to create some real interesting turbulence and realignment in our politics. I'll share my screen very briefly because I have a couple of charts that I know anytime, pollsters say, I've got a bunch of charts to show you, it can be a little scary, but I promise you these will be short and fun. We've tried to take a look at where American voters are at ideologically. We do this survey every June. We're actually about to go back into the field in the next week or so to re-ask this again to see how things have changed over the last year. But this pattern has been pretty consistent over the last couple of years that we've done this, where we ask people for their point of view on a wide range of issues, cultural, social, economic, size of government, you name it, and then kind of give people a score on how liberal or conservative they are on a wide range of issues. We find that very few Americans are actually at the ideological extremes, which I think is something that you all at No Labels are well aware of. And this is something that you all preach day in and day out, that lots of voters do choose a little from column A and a little from column B. They are not all far out on the extremes. But what I do think has caught some folks in, I think, the political establishment, and I kind of hate using that term, but off guard, is the fact that if I ask my friends, how many of you think of yourselves as socially progressive but fiscally conservative? An awful lot of my friends will say yes to that. And when I look at the data, there are very few of those voters in the electorate. In fact, there are quite a few more who are the inverse. They are socially conservative, but they're a little more open to big government. And this is something that Republicans have really begun to move toward and capture in the political marketplace. Another way we represent this is we've done a question, again, we do this every June, where we ask people, if you could choose from one of 5 new political parties, which would it be? We don't give the names of the parties in the survey, but we give these brief descriptions. And they're all intended to look kind of like the parties you have over in, say, Germany. And we have found over the years that interest, especially among conservatives, for this more nationalist populist type party really has increased. You haven't seen a similar thing happen on the Democratic side, where the Green Party has started to say overtake the Labor Party among Democrats. But at least on the Republican side, this notion of we're going to have this traditional center-right party has really been subsumed by this more nationalist, socially conservative, but also economically a little more progressive party. And this has also coincided with the rise of people who think of themselves as Republican, beginning to sort of disassociate from the Republican label and replace it with allegiance to Donald Trump. We have tracked this metric going all the way back to March of 2020, the very start of the COVID pandemic. And we find that when you have a presidential election happening, Donald Trump rises in terms of Republicans being more allied to him. But then it tends to fall when he was out of power and sort of in the wilderness, in exile in Mar-a-Lago. When he comes back, though, into office now, Republicans very much so sort of walked away from what the old Republican Party looks like and have embraced Donald Trump's more populist vision. We see some of this too with the way that young Republicans are behaving. So one question that we've asked that I think is really interesting is, which do you agree with more? It's preferable to have a bigger government providing more services or a smaller government providing fewer services. And a lot of these younger voters that Donald Trump has brought to the GOP coalition, who now think of themselves as Republicans, are not necessarily the sort of fiscal conservatives you might have thought of in the past. In fact, they're twice as likely compared to older Republicans to say, I prefer a bigger government with more services. And we see this when it comes to foreign policy as well, that older Republicans are more likely to take that kind of more traditional Republican perspective of Americans are better off when the US is seen as a strong leader around the world. But a more sort of isolationist, America first type policy has more appeal to those younger Republicans, Gen Z and millennial Republicans. So I went down that rabbit hole basically to say this realignment has changed what I think it means to be Republican and Democratic. And as Republicans have made inroads with groups that they were doing terribly with 10 years ago, younger voters, voters of color, etc., that has corresponded with a shift away from some of the more traditional positions that Republicans have held to some that are a little bit more sort of populist and America first in approach.
So, Kristen, if we take a look at this and think about how this might manifest in the 2026 election. I know it's early, but of course, it's never too early really to be talking about this. There is this strange dynamic going on where, on the one hand, Trump has lost some of the support that we saw post-election, and you sort of actually explained that is that he seems to view his job differently than many voters. Talk about what you mean by that.
So I think that Donald Trump was elected by many voters in the center to be a source of strength and stability, which when I say this, sometimes I get like laughs from people who are not big Donald Trump fans because they think, how can you possibly think of Donald Trump as Mr. Stability? But the argument that I make is that during the Biden presidency, many of these voters who maybe had voted for Joe Biden reluctantly suddenly felt like the control room was empty. They felt like there was no one in charge, and that was leading to a more chaotic world. And so even though Donald Trump likes to talk about himself as a wrecking ball or a bull in a china shop, somebody who would be a stronger leader, however defined, might actually bring about more stability. At least there would be a firmer hand on the wheel. What we've seen now that we're past this first 100 days is whether it's, I mean, tariffs, I think, are the really big piece of this. They're not getting the stability they were looking for. The market feels like it's a roller coaster ride. The world may or may not feel safer. Really, the only issue where I'm seeing Donald Trump have very strong marks from his voters is on immigration, where they do feel like they're getting exactly what they voted for. But when it comes to things like the tariffs and cost of living and his stewardship of the economy, during his first term as president, that was the strongest suit in his polling. You would find voters that said, I don't really like him, I don't like his style, but I do really like what he's doing for the economy. Now you don't find that. In fact, his economic job approval is sometimes lower than his overall job approval. And that's what I think is going to put him and his coalition in Congress in the most jeopardy in the midterm elections. Is he seems to think, I was voted to be your retribution. I was voted in to be a disruptor, to dismantle the administrative state, and to put forward a really bold and dramatic agenda. And what I think he's finding is that there are a fair number of people who voted for him that were looking for a firm hand on the wheel, but for that to not be a firm hand on the wheel driving erratically. And that when especially you look at the polling around tariffs, that's unfortunately for Trump what a lot of voters have perceived him as doing.
I have one last question, and before we open it up to the group. By the way, if anybody wants to ask a question, please just raise your hand, and we'll try to call on you. But Kirsten, I want to turn quickly to the Democrats, and there's this strange dynamic where there have been a couple state elections, special elections thus far this year that gave Democrats some hope. In which their candidates outperformed relative to November 2024. I'm thinking about there were the statewide elections in Wisconsin a little while ago. There were some special elections in Florida for Congress that Republicans won, but by less than they thought. So that would give reason for hope for Democrats. On the other hand, the brand of the party is still in the tank, just and historically so. And I wonder if you could just give a few thoughts on what are really the key drivers of that, just the unpopularity of the party itself. And what are you seeing in the data that tells you the way back for Democrats to kind of regain some of the trust that they have clearly lost from the public?
So there are two things at play here. The good news for Democrats is that voters don't turn out to say thank you. They turn out to say they're mad as hell very frequently. And so right now, when we ask in our polling, how do you feel about the actions that the Trump administration has taken? Republicans generally say they're satisfied. We give a 7-point scale ranging from thrilled to furious, with all of the emotions in between. And Republicans don't tend to pick the most extreme emotion right now. They're picking, I'm satisfied, I'm pleased, I'm happy, but they're not necessarily saying they're thrilled. Democrats are furious. They are all the way at the end of the scale. They are ticked off. And when your voters are ticked off, that means that they are more likely to turn out in the assistant dog catcher election primary in an off year. And that is a dynamic that is really, really, really helping Democrats right now in these special elections, et cetera. It's part of why Republicans were skittish about allowing any more members of the House to be appointed to positions within Trump's cabinet. That dynamic is very, very, very real. And it's likely to benefit Democrats in these statewide elections in places like Virginia and New Jersey coming this November. It's likely to continue benefiting Democrats as we get to the midterms. And this is supercharged by the fact that in that realignment we just talked about, Republicans have gained some voters and they have shed some voters. And the voters they have gained tend to be voters who will turn out in a presidential year when Donald Trump is on the ballot, but don't really turn out in other elections. Again, they tend to be a younger electorate, more working class, but a little bit less politically plugged in, where Democrats have now absorbed the voters Republicans have shed, who are more likely to be news junkies. They are more likely to know exactly when that assistant dog catcher election is happening, and they're going to turn out for it. And so as that has shifted, it used to be the case that Republicans would benefit in low turnout elections because they had the more reliable voters. That's no longer the case anymore. The downside for Democrats, and the reason why you're seeing their numbers get worse in terms of party brand, is they're going through what Republicans went through about 15 years ago during the Tea Party movement era, where the reason their numbers are falling is not necessarily because voters in the center are getting more negative about them. It's because their own party members are getting more negative about them. This is why for a long time Republicans had a more negative brand than Democrats, because Democrats thought their party was doing okay, while Republicans loved to rage against their own party leaders. I mean, I could do any focus group and you would find Republicans who thought that Mitch McConnell was selling them out on a daily basis. Meanwhile, if I actually talked to my friends who were Democrats, they thought Mitch McConnell was a strategic genius who was putting points on the board for the conservative cause every day, but that just wasn't how Republican voters saw it. So you're seeing that same dynamic play out with Democrats, where not only are they reporting in my polls that they are furious, but they report that they think their own party leaders are not nearly as mad as they are and are too conciliatory and are not being aggressive enough in countering Trump. Now, where does the Democratic Party go from here? I think is an interesting open question, because we also asked among the Democrats in our survey, would you rather see your party go to the left, stay where it is, or move to the center? And very few Democratic voters actually want to see their party move to the left. So this is something that's different than what Republicans went through when they went through their Tea Party moment. It was, we're mad at our party establishment and we want our party to ideologically move to the right. Here, Democrats' base and their activist class are not aligned. Reliable Democratic voters are not looking for the party to make a sharp left turn. They are looking, if anything, for it to stay about on course ideologically, if not move a little more to the center. But they are looking for the party to take a more aggressive tone, posture, and tactics. They're looking to see their party actually put some wins up on the board against Donald Trump. That doesn't mean embracing far left policies, but they want their party to be more aggressive and strategically smart in their view. And so I don't necessarily know what that means for Democrats, but I do know that it puts their leadership in a tough position, because it's not clear ideologically where the party wants you to go. And then how do you fight Donald Trump in a way that still keeps you palatable to those voters in the center? I don't envy Democratic leaders having to navigate those waters.
Obviously, this is a little anecdotal, but how do you think about, the attendance that you see at the Bernie and AOC oligarchy tour? I mean, they're getting thousands of people when they host these events. But do you read that more as the people going there saying, I'm endorsing the fight and the anti-Trump part of this, but I'm not necessarily signing on to Medicare for all and the Green New Deal?
I think that's possible. Again, because when you look at that chart I showed earlier of like, which party do you choose? Only a very small portion of American voters say they want to choose, what we described in our survey as a party that would pass a Green New Deal, break up big corporations, promote social and economic justice. Like those are the sorts of things that only 7% of voters said that's the party I would want. Far more said they wanted something that looked a little bit more like put the middle class first, maybe raise taxes on the wealthy. That's not just a sort of AOC wing type thing. Support programs for those less well off, but that's not the same as a big, Medicare for all, democratic socialism type approach. So I think some of it is at least Bernie and AOC are out there fighting a fight. And I think that is what is bringing in people who might otherwise think, well, what am I supposed to do right now? I have this pent up energy. I have this frustration. I want to channel it somewhere. where do I go? They're providing an outlet for that.
Yeah. I'm going to get to some questions. Before I do, though, I want to remind everybody who's on the call of something, and you'll hear us talking about this more in the next couple of weeks. A reminder that on June 26th at 8:30 in the morning, we're going to have our first ever public meeting to make Congress work. So we're going to have House members, Senate members. You'll actually likely see some unfamiliar faces there. We're opening up the tent a little bigger for this, for some non-traditional no labels allies will probably be there. The way I think to think of this is like a first date, because as Kristen will probably know really well, Democrats and Republicans are at such loggerheads in Washington over so many issues. They don't even have an ability to talk to one another. So before we can get them making more substantive compromises, we want to get them at least in a room talking, being civil, and that's what we want to do on the 26th. So if you haven't signed up for that live webcast, please do so. With that, let me get to some questions, starting with Mary Beth. And Mary, if you could just say your name and where you're from. Mary Beth, over to you.
Hi, I'm in Houston, Texas. I'm a big fan of the Dispatch, and I know you're friends with Sarah Isgur. I asked them the other day, where are the conservatives, kind of the young up and coming conservatives, and they think that, Mike Gallagher and even Paul Ryan are maybe just waiting in the wings and Trump will implode and they'll come running back in. My question is, are there going to be any conservative voters left? So I think of it traditionally more smaller government and less government interference in things, and that is not Trumpism. I still want that fiscal conservatism, but if you're saying that more and more voters want more government, will there be any ground left for conservatives? And then two, do you think if younger people are kind of wanting more government, will they get mad enough at Social Security and Medicare and how much that's eating up of the budget? Is it possible to kind of sell them and say, you have got to address these programs because 60 to 70% of our budget is going to people over 65? So two different questions there.
Sure. Well, I'll try to tackle both of them. I think on the first one, it's unclear to me which way is the causation going. Is it that Republicans are becoming more, as a party, embracing larger government because of Trump or because of the voters Trump has brought to the party? Or is it the other way around? Is it because of the shift in party or in position, that is what has brought new voters to the party? 10 years ago, I wrote a book all about what I thought Republicans needed to do to win over millennials. And very candidly, everything Donald Trump did when he came down the golden escalator 2 weeks after my book came out was like the opposite of what I would have recommended Republicans do to win young voters. And yet I, even with great humility, have to acknowledge that in the last election, he did better with younger voters than any Republican presidential candidate has done since George W. Bush in 2004. And he did so by, in a sort of sideways, bizarro universe way, implementing some of the things I recommended, which included go find young voters where they're at, use new digital channels to reach them, and recognize that a message of pure fiscal conservatism is not necessarily what young people are looking for, that they believe that systems are broken. They're looking for things to be shaken up, but simply saying we need to cut government spending isn't in and of itself an appealing message. Donald Trump did that. Now, I do have concerns up to the second point you make, that if we don't get size and scope of government and spending under control, those are going to have massive long-term downstream effects for young people. And in a way, I almost feel like the messaging about how badly these programs are broken has almost made young voters think, well, I'm never going to see it anyways, and sort of throw up their hands. And so it winds up not being a top tier issue because for them, they think, well, I'm not going to see this anyways. And so, the idea of a solution feels far-fetched to them. So I think those things are a little bit related, but I do think that there's a chance, if you are looking for something optimistic, that the pendulum is always swinging. None of these trends are forever. If you had told me halfway through the George W. Bush presidency that our next president would be an up-and-coming freshman senator named Barack Obama, it would have seemed unfathomable. And if you would have told me halfway through Obama's presidency that he was going to be followed by Donald Trump, I would have found that to be unfathomable. And so I try to be very humble about what I think about where things are headed. And I always believe the pendulum will swing.
Thank you.
Kristen, I want to hop in with one question about obviously the most important thing domestically that's moving in DC right now is the one big beautiful bill legislation that we see the House passed. It is now over to the Senate. Have you seen any polling yet on what voters think of this right now, or is it not well defined enough in their mind? Do they not even know what's in it yet?
There are so many moving pieces to this bill that the polling on it is unbelievably susceptible to question wording or what piece of the bill you highlight. So, if I were to describe it as a bill that is going to continue the current tax cuts that were first put into place in 2017, voters go, that sounds great. If you say it's a bill that is going to cut taxes on the wealthy, they say that's not so great. If you say it's going to cut funding from Medicaid, they say that's not so great. If you say it's going to potentially reduce the deficit by X amount or raise the deficit by X amount, I mean, depending on how you analyze the impact of the bill, that also has a big effect. So really, it is a little bit of a black box for voters. I do think it's creating some interesting, strange bedfellows coalitions right now. So I'll give you an example. I did a poll that came out last week for Common Sense Media. They're nonpartisan. They're very interested in the effect of technology on kids and families. And they are very concerned about a piece of the Build Back Better, or Build Back Better, one big beautiful bill. We have too many BBB bills in Washington. The big beautiful bill that says states would be prohibited from regulating AI for a 10-year period. When we tested out, even with really neutral language, we found that people were very worried about that. They don't necessarily like the idea of tying states' hands. And suddenly, just minutes ago, before I hopped on the Zoom, I saw Marjorie Taylor Greene, of all people, saying, if I had known this provision was in the bill, I wouldn't have voted for it. So you have these things, whether it is Josh Hawley saying, I don't want cuts to Medicaid, or now Marjorie Taylor Greene saying, I don't like this provision that says we're going to ban states from regulating AI. There are a lot of interesting competing ideological things going on here that I still think ultimately this is going to get across the finish line, but not without a lot of consternation along the way because of the new ideological fault lines within the Republican Party.
Interesting. Gail, you have a question. Gail, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, in the conversation, some of the things I haven't heard is compromise, integrity, imposing, balance, relationship building. I mean, all these things seem to be important in solving the problem. I mean, we talk about big government, small government. Why is it relevant or not relevant? You can have a small, effective government, and you can have a big, ineffective government. Are we really focusing on the things that matter and understand? Because you're making assumptions that, there seems like a lot of assumptions about if you have big government, you have better. But we also know that's not true, depending on the individuals that are in it. Relationship building, we have seen a decline in Congress, relationship building among the different parties and focusing on compromise, integrity. I mean, everybody has rights. I tell my friends from different political perspectives, everybody has a right to like and not like. Where the compromise is to balance the imposition on all sides so that everybody can coexist peacefully. So what do we do? What are the solutions? The house is falling apart.
So, Kristen, I think Gail's getting at a really interesting question, and we've seen in our polling is that if you ask, and you've seen this, if you ask voters, do you want to see leaders who compromise and cooperate? On balance, they will say yes, but will they really go to the mat for that? Do they really care about that above others as a thing that drives their voting?
Yeah, one challenge is that when voters report in polls that they want compromise, too often their vision of compromise is I want the other side to compromise with me. And so that makes it very challenging to actually get compromise to happen. When you say, would you rather get a little bit of what you want while giving up a little bit of what the other side wants? Or would you rather get nothing done and hold the line? When you frame it that way, you still do find voters that say, I really do want some compromise. But what's the big problem that's underlying all of this is that lack of sort of relationship building that Kale was talking about, and trust, and belief that the other side isn't just wrong, but is evil, morally defective. There was a poll I did, this was a number of years ago, but I found this result to always be a little bit amusing, might not be the right word, but we asked people, we asked Trump voters, do you view the other party as people who are bad people who want to destroy the country, or are they good people who have bad ideas about how to run the country? And a majority actually picked the first option, that more harsh, like these are bad people on the other side. But then the next question we asked was, which would you prefer? Finding ways to get things done, even if it means working with Democrats sometimes, or holding the line and not getting things done so as not to compromise with them. And you still had a majority saying like, yeah, I think they might be bad people, but I do think that we still need to compromise with them. So I think that a way you're going to unlock more compromise is if we begin to ratchet down the other side is bad and is a threat. It's that heightened level of threat that makes people think, well, compromise might be nice in theory, but man, if I open the door a crack, they're going to rush in and then they're going to take advantage of me and my side. And I can't allow that to happen.
Yeah. John, I'm sorry, Judy, and then John. Judy, go ahead. Judy, you still with us? Okay, John, go ahead.
Hi, John Leonard in Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina. Kristen, always enjoy your TV commentary. I have a process question, and that is you had some great graphics there. But nowadays, they talk about pollsters having so much difficulty. You can't get people on a landline anymore. We don't answer these with caller ID. What is your process for ensuring that you're getting good data that you're showing us in those graphics?
Oh, I love this question. How much time do you have? I'll try to keep it I'll try to keep it as brief as possible while trying to also be satisfying in my answer. You're right. It's very hard because every time technology creates a new way for me as a pollster to reach you, it creates 5 new ways for you to evade me. So, wow, text message polling has really risen as a new way to reach people. But also, you can very easily hit report junk, go away. I don't want polls for texting me from this random number, and so on and on it goes. The one thing that is very helpful is because polling about politics is just a teeny piece of the polling that all goes on. The vast majority of opinion research in this country has nothing to do with politics, and it's about testing, what do you think of this shoe brand? What do you think of this potato chip company? What do you think of this beer maker? And so on and so forth. That there's actually a ton of investment in the world of opinion research to try to continue to make sure that it's good and reliable. And then for the political side, the overlay we put on this is we do a lot of online opinion research using these market research panels that are set up where 95% of the surveys these people are taking are about what type of beer do you like, what type of groceries are you buying, what type of car do you want to buy, those sorts of things. And we look at people we can match back to the voter file, the publicly available list of everybody who's a voter. We have a very robust database at Echelon of who all these people are, and we can make sure that when someone enters one of our surveys, that they are a real person who is really matched up on the voter file. That's piece number 1. We then have about 5 other steps that we undergo before a survey is finished to do things where we try to weed out bots that are trying to pose as people who are rushing through a survey and not paying attention. We've got a lot of other checks in place, but to be very candid with you, it is getting harder and harder every day. And the rise of AI is going to make us pollsters have even more of a tough job trying to keep inauthentic or fraudulent respondents out, even as the real respondents become harder and harder to find.
Thanks, Kirsten. Myron. You are on mute.
Got it. Myron Backus from the San Francisco Bay Area, the suburbs. My question is about the gender gap. So your earlier slides you showed, and a lot of the things we hear about is shifting dynamics along race lines, age lines, those sorts of things. My perception is that the gender gap is just huge and not shifting at all, maybe getting more divided. And if another perception I have, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that if you look at those extreme slivers that you called out earlier on one of your slides, kind of the extreme liberals, extreme nationalists, the gender gap is just insane, right? I that's my perception. What's it going to take to get? What's it going to take for the pendulum to swing on that? I saw some recent news about high-level Democrats holding some conferences specifically focused on winning men back. Yeah, I'm just curious to hear your opinion on when is that ever going to become a little more reasonable? I know Dobbs had a little bit to do with that, but I just think it goes way beyond Dobbs.
Yeah. So I unfortunately don't have a solution, but I can at least unpack what I see is driving this gap, and maybe that can highlight ideas with this group of how to address it. Really, the gender gap among younger Americans has been growing for some time. It even predates the entire Donald Trump era. Back when I was writing my book about how Republicans at the time were struggling with young voters, almost all of that shift was because young women were trending away from the GOP. Young men were staying about where they were, kind of politically split down the middle, but it was young women who were moving further and further to the left. So when we think about this gender gap, the shift in young men to the right is somewhat modest and fairly recent. The bigger, longer term, and more dramatic trend has been the shift of young women to the left. And it's not just Dobbs, although Dobbs is a big piece of it. You know, back when I wrote my book, one of the things that I thought was a surprising finding was that if you asked people their views on abortion back in 2014, there was not a big generation gap, and there wasn't a big gender gap either. That young men, young women, older women, there weren't huge differences on that issue. Today, there are huge differences on that issue. But I think another thing that is driving it is that increasingly for Gen Z, they are getting news and information about the world around them and political issues from places and spaces that are more gendered. So the irony is that this is a generation that embraces gender fluidity, gender as a spectrum. It's not just binary, a little bit more than other generations, and yet they find themselves more likely to be split into this binary, where for young women, they're more likely to encounter content about politics online that is progressive, that is coming from the sorts of influencers, et cetera, that they follow, and that's moving them more to the left, just as the sorts of influencers lots of men follow, the podcasts they're listening to, et cetera, those voices are tending to espouse slightly more conservative views. And so that is creating, you know, I joke that back when I was a teenager, young men and young women generally got information about music, what was going on in the world, et cetera, from kind of the same places. If you were a young woman, maybe you had 17 magazine, you know, you had some places that were slightly like just for girls or just for guys. But now you can have an entire online ecosystem of information that flows to you that is really targeted at you in part because you are a young man or a young woman. And it can look very different. If you have a teenage son and a teenage daughter, they may not see any of the same content about what's going on in the world, what culture looks like, et cetera. And that, in my view, and Daniel Cox at AEI does a ton of research on this, is one of the other big root causes of this gender divide we're seeing among Gen Z that looks very different than what you see for older generations.
Kristen, one thing we haven't talked about much yet is the public's view of foreign policy right now. And of course, you know, for so long, the unifying thing that held Americans together was the Cold War. And then even for a period of time after 9/11, it was this, we'd been attacked. And so it was this sense of the war on terror. Do you sense any of that on the horizon where whether it is China or something else, that is there an organizing external threat that you feel like people are concerned about across the spectrum?
So right now, in polling about foreign policy, one, the issue is pretty low on the priority list for voters because they perceive that problems here at home, whether it's cost of living, whether it's immigration, et cetera, to be such crisis levels that they almost feel like they can't even look to what's going on overseas. They just have to focus at home. But we are also at a time of, in some ways, you know, blessedly peacetime here at home that has meant that foreign policy can sit on the back burner in the minds of a lot of voters, even as there is great turbulence all around the world. You have it in Ukraine, you have it in the Middle East, etc. When it comes to voters who are younger, for many of them, they have grown up in an era where they don't have good examples of what America projecting power overseas looks like that leads to positive outcomes. So for voters who are sort of Gen X and older, they're like, yeah, winning the Cold War was good. It was great that we beat the Soviets. It was great that our ideology took root and prevailed, and America being the world leader, that was a good thing. But if you're from Gen Z, you don't necessarily feel that way. Maybe you have been taught that America is bad and our influence around the world has always been a bad thing, or whatever that message looks like. Or you're somebody who looks at the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and says, those were mistakes. We shouldn't have done that. Look what happens when we try to get too engaged. And so I do think that there is not necessarily a desire for America to pull back completely off of the world stage. People would still like America to be influential, but there's a really high bar for interest in, say, American military engagement. When I've looked at polls around what should we do if Taiwan is ever invaded, I see lots of data that says we should tell them we support them and we should perhaps sell them arms, but under no circumstances should we send a single American troop to the defense of Taiwan. Tends to be what I see pop up in polls. Same sorts of things with Ukraine. You would see lots of support for, even among Republicans, I feel like that's not a sort of well-known thing, but even Republicans for some time said, yes, let's send them weapons. But I don't know that I want to send my own troops there. This doesn't feel like my kind of fight. And that right now is the dominant flavor of foreign policy polling. But I want to conclude on that note by saying polling on foreign policy is unbelievably malleable. When it comes to something like healthcare, people know how they think about healthcare. They know what they feel, and their views are not moving dramatically month to month. But on something like foreign policy, a bomb goes off somewhere in the world and suddenly polls can move enormously because suddenly people are looking at the dangers around the world through an entirely different set of eyes. And so I always caution people, while polls around other issues tend to be pretty sticky, polling around foreign policy can shift dramatically overnight and is among the most susceptible to events.
One thing that has been notable that some people have observed on foreign policy polling is attitudes around Israel in particular. And this is something that historically bipartisan support for Israel has been pretty strong, pretty broad. We are starting to see some of that break down now, especially among younger voters. I get really, because I just have two questions. So number one, what is it that is making it this wedge where you can't guarantee bipartisan support for Israel anymore? But I think that the second thing is, why is this issue such a central issue increasingly? I mean, if you think about this is a country of 8 million people in the Middle East. There's a lot of other bigger countries, and yet so much attention comes in to this little part of the world. What is driving this?
I think one, the social media era, and this being a conflict that is playing out in the social media era, is a huge thing that is sort of undergirding a lot of this. It is meaning that a generation that may have, if they had been, come of age in the 1990s, think about something like Operation Desert Storm and that conflict in the Middle East, the war, back before you really even have the internet being common in people's homes. You may have young people who are plugged in on that issue, but it's not as defining on, say, college campuses as the way you do now, where it is, you can have images sent to you, in some cases misinformation sent to you right into your pocket, right with you all the time, to make you feel much more connected to what's going on in that conflict, and therefore really not just touch you at a rational level, but at an emotional level. I think that's part of why we're seeing this issue be so prominent in the minds of so many young people. At the same time, a lot of what I'm seeing is not necessarily that large numbers of young people actually sympathize with Hamas or actually take their side in the conflict, but rather that the waters have been muddied, and that for young people who have been exposed to a lot of content online about this conflict, they don't necessarily think there are good guys to root for, and instead just feel horribly for the civilians who have been affected. And so you see a lot of that kind of, I don't know who I side with in this conflict, or I don't know who I support, or I don't know if we should be supporting anybody besides giving aid to civilians, is why I think you see that pop up in so many of the polls.
Yeah. Another thing that I think people are still obviously trying to get their head around is AI and all the different implications with it. Right now, do you feel like voters generally are looking at the positive potential aspects of AI, which is, hey, it's going to help me, do my research better, and it's going to give us medical advances and everything else? Or are they worried more about, the fear that it's going to do something like, happen in Terminator? Where does that, where do they kind of come out at the moment?
So it's a good question. And I'd say it's a little bit of everything. In general, when I have been polling on AI, I see voters having some areas where they are optimistic. Hey, maybe this will give me the ability to do my job better, while at the same time also harboring that fear, maybe this will make it so that I don't have to do my job at all, and therefore I don't have a job. And so it's, which way is this going to go? Is it's going to make me better and more efficient and more creative at my job? Or is it going to take my job? The jury is still out for an awful lot of people on which way this is going to break. I don't tend to see a ton of alarm around things like a Terminator type scenario, but I do. So I mentioned earlier that I did that survey for Common Sense Media. We ask questions about things like, how worried are you about deep fakes and people being, either dealing with fraud as a result of a deep fake, or kids and teens being exposed to highly sexualized AI generated content online. I mean, these are really acute concerns that cut across the board. And it's kind of, as an organization like you all are, where you are interested in going beyond party lines, these areas of concern around AI, as well as optimism around AI, actually don't break down along party lines in the way that polling on a million other issues these days does. Republicans are just as likely as Democrats to say they worry about the type of content that AI can create being served to young children online, or deep fakes being something that can cause, an uptick in fraud and victimize innocent people. Those are not partisan concerns at all. And I think what is really interesting was in that survey that I did, I wanted to pressure test some of this because, again, people do see upsides of AI. They do worry about what happens if China, beats us in the race to AI. Like, those are real concerns. How is this going to affect our economy? We don't want to get left behind. But when you put head to head, do we need to be more mindful of the risks, or more inclined to unleash this to capture all of the benefits? There is still this caution of, I think we need to take this carefully rather than just let this completely run away. I think that's also why you're seeing, for instance, somebody like a Marjorie Taylor Greene suddenly say, whoa, 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 it is on this issue that I am off the train of the one big beautiful bill. I don't want this I worry about this getting out of hand. I think the risks weigh heavily on a lot of people, even as they do hope that there will be upsides.
So it's interesting. This is an area where some of the polling you're finding transcends partisan divides. I guess the thing I'd like to close on is, what are some of the other issues that you look at where you say to yourself, look, if there were some Democrats and Republicans in Congress who actually had the guts to try to do some things together, what are those issues that they'd actually get you think, an overwhelmingly favorable response from the public?
So an area that I would love to see more bipartisanship on are things like childcare and paid family leave. You may recall a couple of years ago, Governor Glenn Youngkin wins election for governor of Virginia, and suddenly Republicans really embrace this message. We're going to be the party of parents. And yet progress has been somewhat slow going on things like childcare or paid leave that are really, really, really acute issues that someone who is a parent of young children is going to be dealing with. And so while there are lots of sort of high profile clashes over things like what books should kids have in school, there are fewer, I think, there's a lot of heat and not a lot of light around those sorts of things. I would like to see more light around what can we do on something like paid leave or childcare. And in all of the polling that I've done on that topic, we do see that, conservatives, who again might not be interested in a government solution, government providing universal pre-K, anything like that, but they do still want to see something potentially done on the issue, because for them, family is really important. They worry that young couples these days are too afraid to have kids because of how expensive and burdensome it is. And there are ways to have these interesting cross-partisan, cross-ideological conversations when it comes to something like, how do we make it easier for young parents to start families or grow their families? That's something that Republicans and Democrats, I think, alike can come together on.
Kristen, you've been so generous with your time, and we don't want to take too much of it. But before we go, I just want to ask, is there anything else we haven't talked about that is coming up in your polling that you just think is really fascinating and you think people on this call should know about?
Ooh, it's a wonderful question. There was a number that was floating around this morning that I'll leave you with. And I wonder to what extent this number tells us a little bit about this kind of rising populism and how we ought to think about it when it pops up in the polls. It was a survey done by Morning Consult where they asked people, what is the salary that you think you'll need to feel successful in life? And there was a big, I think the median salary in the survey was something like $200,000 a year.
Yeah.
But the difference between Gen Z and everyone else was massive. That for Gen Z, they drove that number up because they said, it will take me over $500,000 a year to feel like I'm successful. And I don't know if that's because they're coming of age in an era where just the dollar means less than it did for someone who's a baby boomer, because they are a generation that may want to buy a house and sees how expensive a house is, where somebody who's a baby boomer may not realize, wow, in order to buy a house in a fast-growing metro, here's how much it costs. Or is it that Gen Z has just been exposed to content online that tells them everybody's got a Lamborghini, everybody's got a nice Pinterest-worthy house. Why don't you? You're not successful if you don't. And so is it that they are experiencing genuine economic hardship? And I think there's some real truth to that, what does a median wage today look like compared to a median wage 30, 40 years ago? But then how is that also intersecting with this social media content that they're getting fed that is leading them to think you can't be considered successful unless you're making $500,000?
Yeah.
I want to do more polling to see, is that just a weird data anomaly? Is there a different way you can ask the question that would lead a different result? But I think understanding Gen Z's feeling of grievance, feeling that they've been totally screwed, and not coming at it from a perspective of saying they're wrong or they've been brainwashed into thinking that, believing there's some real truth to them feeling like the world they're growing up in is hard. But I want to unpack so much more in that. I want to understand why they said that in that poll.
Well, especially because the policy implications of that are so different. I mean, if the data is that, yes, objectively they're behind the eight ball more, and that leads to one set of policy outcomes, and if it's social media envy, they're still just as disappointed, but that leads to a different set of policy solutions too. Kristen, thank you so much for joining us. Kristen Soltis Anderson, Echelon Insights, New York Times, and elsewhere. You can find a lot of her commentaries. Want to remind everybody, I mentioned it earlier, if you have not signed up, June 26th, No Labels meeting to make Congress work. And we'll look forward to seeing you all again shortly. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, everybody.